Daniel Cross had never known defeat. At 32, he sat at the very top of Wall Street, a man carved from ambition and ice. The newspapers called him ruthless. The boardrooms whispered another name, the Ice King, every detail about him reinforced the myth. The tailored gray suits cut razor sharp against his lean frame, the piercing steel eyes that never wavered, the voice that spoke of billions as though they were mere coins sliding across a poker table. Daniel commanded attention not through volume but through precision. He could walk into a room filled with CEOs and seasoned bankers, and within minutes the balance of power shifted to him. On a bleak Monday morning in Manhattan, the city groaned. Under gray skies, but inside the glass-walled tower of Cross and Partners, the numbers only climbed higher. A dozen screens glowed in Daniel's corner office, each tracking acquisitions, mergers, futures, his empire expanding with every tick. From his vantage point 30 stories above the street, Daniel looked down at Manhattan like a monarch surveying his kingdom. The streets churned with taxis, investors hustled with cell phones glued to their ears, and far below, the stock exchange pulsed like a living beast. To Daniel, it was all his board, game, and arena. His assistant appeared at the doorway, careful, almost reverent, as though interrupting a ritual. "Mr. Cross, the board is ready for you." Daniel adjusted his cufflinks, polished silver, understated but commanding, and rose from his chair. He didn't simply walk. He moved like someone who knew he owned the outcome. The world was a chessboard, and he was always 3 moves ahead. Inside the boardroom, silence followed him like a shadow. Directors sat straighter, their pens stilling. On notepads, their words fumbling. The Ice King didn't tolerate hesitation. He presented a new acquisition plan worth billions, slicing through objections with logic colder than steel. When he was finished, the room erupted in reluctant applause. Another victory, another empire absorbed. Daniel thrived on this. The relentless climb, the thrill of conquest, the knowledge that no one could touch him. While others faltered, he adapted, consistently sharper, always faster. He didn't need warmth, he didn't need friends, he needed results, and he got them. By noon, the deal was sealed. By afternoon, the headlines buzzed with praise. Cross expands again, the billionaire who never misses. And by nightfall, Daniel sat back in his office, overlooking the city wrapped in steel and glass, untouchable. But power is a fragile thing, and Daniel, for all his foresight, never saw the storm coming. It began not with a whisper, but with a scream. Sirens. The boardroom triumph lasted only hours. By the time Daniel Cross stepped back into the marble lobby of Cross and Partners, the world had already shifted beneath his feet. First, the sound of sirens slicing through Manhattan traffic was loud and urgent. Then came the sudden rush of movement. Men and women in navy windbreakers stamped with 3 white letters, FBI. They swarmed the lobby like a tidal wave. Agents flashed badges, barking orders, while uniformed officers sealed off the revolving doors. The marble echoed with the heavy thud of boots and the cameras clicking just outside the glass. Daniel froze for a split second. Around him, employees gasped, clutching their briefcases as though paper contracts could shield them. His jaw tightened. "There must be some mistake," he said, striding toward the nearest agent. His tone was clipped, calm, the voice that had once reduced executives to silence. But this time it carried no weight. "Step aside, sir," the agent barked, sweeping past him toward the elevators. Another seized files from the receptionist's desk. A team moved toward the server room. Within minutes, chaos ruled what had once been Daniel's kingdom. Outside, the press had already gathered. Cameras flashed like lightning against the storm clouds, reporters shouting his name, their words colliding into a frenzy. Fraud investigation. Billions missing. Wall Street's Ice King under fire. By evening, the story spread across every channel. Every ticker. His face, once a symbol of ruthless success, now framed in bold red headlines. Hudson Capital fraud ex-Pacedras under FBI investigation. The Ice King falls. Daniel returned to his penthouse long after midnight, the city skyline glittering. Beyond his floor, 2 ceiling windows. He didn't turn on the lights. He just stood there in the dark, staring at the reflection of a man suddenly dethroned. He hadn't done it. He knew he hadn't, but the evidence told a different story. Perfectly timed emails, records showing billions siphoned through shell companies, transactions with his digital signature. All of it pointed directly at him, and all of it was airtight. Be wide on. Allies had turned into enemies. Former partners released carefully rehearsed statements, severing ties. Investors spat his name like poison. The woman he'd been casually seeing sent a single message: can't be associated with a criminal. The empire Daniel had built with cold precision collapsed overnight. He was untouchable no longer. For the first time in his life, he had no move left. Daniel Cross left Manhattan before the sun rose. No chauffeur, no armored car, no entourage, just a single suitcase and a one-way ticket clutched in his hand. For the first time in years, no one followed him. No cameras, no reporters, no board members are watching his every step, only silence. The train cut through the countryside, carrying him farther from the glassed hours of New York. Daniel sat by the window, staring at the blur of trees and empty fields. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, gray eyes hollow, jaw tight, a ghost of the man once called the Ice King. He had no plan, no destination. He only knew he had to disappear. Hours later, the train screeched into a small station marked by a weathered sign, Willow Creek, the town barely registered on the map. A few clapboard houses, a main street lined with mom and pop shops, and silence broken only by the rustle of leaves in the autumn wind. It was the kind of place Daniel had once dismissed without a thought, too small, too quiet, irrelevant, yet. As he stepped off the train, suitcase in hand, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders, it felt like the only place he could breathe. He rented a room above a diner on Main Street under a new name, Daniel Hale. The innkeeper didn't ask questions. He just handed him a brass key and pointed to the narrow staircase. The room was small, creaky bed, peeling wallpaper, a lamp that flickered when switched on. It smelled faintly of bacon grease drifting up from the diner below. For the first time in days, Daniel slept. 2 weeks passed. He kept to himself, walking the quiet streets with his coat collar turned up. Of course, the townsfolk noticed strangers in small towns, but they didn't pry. A nod here, a polite smile there, nothing more. And for that, Daniel was grateful. On a rainy afternoon, seeking shelter from a sudden downpour, he ducked into a shop at the corner of Main and Willow. A small brass bell chimed as he opened the door. The air smelled of paper and dust. Wooden shelves stretched in narrow aisles, stacked high with worn novels and fading hardcovers. Above the counter, a faded sign read, Willow Creek Books. Behind the counter stood a woman, bent over a ledger. She looked up at the sound of the bell. Chestnut brown hair framed her face, and her eyes, clear, steady, met his with polite curiosity. "Hi there," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, looking for something in particular. Daniel hesitated, shifting his weight. He hadn't set foot in a bookstore in years. Reading had been a waste of time in his old world. Deals mattered. Numbers mattered. Books did not. "No," he said curtly, just waiting out the rain. Her eyebrows lifted slightly at his tone, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she offered a small smile and returned to her ledger. Daniel drifted along the shelves, running his fingers across the spines without reading the titles. The silence unnerved him. He was used to the hum of Wall Street, the buzz of phones, the bark of traders. There was only the patter of rain and the faint rustle of pages. Almost without thinking, he pulled a book from the shelf. The cover showed a man standing at a crossroads. He flipped it open, more out of habit than interest. "Good choice," the woman's voice said from behind him. Daniel turned sharply. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him with an expression neither pitying nor deferential, just steady. "That one's about starting over when everything falls apart." "I didn't ask for a recommendation," he replied, his voice clipped, the old arrogance bleeding through. "No," she said evenly, "but you look like you needed one." Daniel stiffened. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not since before he had become the Ice King. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel," he said after a pause. "Emily Carter," she replied, extending her hand, "owner of this little corner of the world." Her palm was warm. He felt cold. The rain eventually stopped. But Daniel lingered longer than he meant to. Something about Emily unsettled him. She didn't know who he was, didn't care. She wasn't impressed by his sharp suit or commanding presence. If anything, she seemed immune to it. When he finally left, the bell chiming behind him, Daniel's pulse was unsteady. He told himself it was nothing, just a rainy afternoon, just a small-town bookseller. But as he returned to his rented room, her voice lingered in his mind. For the first time since his fall, Daniel Cross wondered who he might be without the ice. Life in Willow Creek moved at a pace Daniel Cross had never known. The town woke slowly with the diner's coffee pot chime and the rustle of newspapers on porches. Neighbors waved to passing cars. Children biked down cracked sidewalks. Conversations lingered on street corners about the weather, church potlucks, and whose barn roof needed fixing. Daniel kept to himself, hands shoved into his coat pockets, head down. He wasn't Daniel Cross here. He was Daniel Hale, the quiet stranger renting the room above the diner. For a time, that was enough. But the silence pressed on him. At night, lying awake in the narrow bed, he felt the emptiness gnaw. He had once defined his worth by glowing screens and climbing numbers. Here, stripped of all that, he asked himself a question he'd never faced. Without power, who am I? One afternoon, he found himself standing again outside Willow Creek Books. The crooked signs swayed in the wind and the familiar brass bell waited above the door. He told himself it was a coincidence that he was only passing through. Yet when he stepped inside, the bell chimed as though it had been waiting for him. Emily Carter stood on a stepladder, shelving books. She glanced over her shoulder, faint amusement curling her lips. "Back again. Rain is keeping you hostage, or is it me this time?" Daniel frowned. "Neither. Just walking by." "Well, since you're here," she said, nodding toward a heavy box on the floor, "make yourself useful. Hand me that, will you?" He blinked. "Excuse me." The box, she repeated, her tone dry, unless lifting something heavier than a pen is beneath. You, Daniel's mouth tightened, but before he could reply, he bent, gripped the box, and lifted it easily. He set it down beside the ladder with a dull thud. Thank you, Emily said, sliding another book into place. See? Not so hard, Daniel exhaled slowly. You're bossy for someone running a store no one visits. Her eyes narrowed, but instead of snapping back, she climbed down, brushing dust from her jeans. Maybe you're right, business isn't great, but this place matters to me, books matter to me. That's more than I can say for half the people in your Wall Street towers. Daniel stiffened. What do you know about Wall Street? Nothing, she admitted with a shrug, but I know armor when I see it. You wear arrogance like a shield. The words cut deeper than he expected. Over the following days, Daniel kept drifting back to the bookstore. He told himself it was a chance or boredom, but Emily had a way of pulling him in without asking. She talked about her father who had built the shop from nothing and left it to her when he passed. She admitted the debts, the competition from big box chains and online giants, yet she refused to let it die. Why fight for something already failing? Daniel asked one evening, stacking books beside her. Because it's worth it, Emily said. Because not everything valuable can be measured in profit margins. Some things matter because they touch people. Daniel had no reply. That night, Emily pressed a book into his hands. You can't haunt a bookstore without actually reading, she teased. Reluctantly, Daniel opened it later in his room. It was a novel about a man who had lost everything only to find himself in unexpected places. At first he scoffed, flipping through pages with disinterest, but then hours slipped by unnoticed. By dawn he realized he had read until his eyes burned. The words struck chords he didn't know existed. For the first time he wondered if his empire had been built not on strength but on ice. The more time he spent at Willow Creek Books, the more he noticed. Emily greeted each customer by name and tucked extra bookmarks into the children's bags. The laugh lines around her eyes when she smiled. Daniel found himself repairing the shop's loose hinge, carrying boxes, and even operating the register when Emily was called away. He was clumsy, awkward, glaring too much, but Emily only grinned. Not bad, she said once, handing him a cup of coffee, though you really should work on that death stare. Customers don't bite. I wasn't glaring, he muttered. You were, she said, smiling, but don't worry, they'll get used to you. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. She didn't fear him. She didn't worship him. She treated him like a man nothing more, nothing less. One evening, as golden light filtered through the windows, Daniel lingered after closing. Emily leaned against the counter, exhaustion softening her posture. You ever think about giving this up? He asked quietly. Every week, she admitted with a tired laugh. But then someone comes in, finds a story that changes them, and I remember why I keep going. Daniel hesitated, then spoke words he'd never voiced aloud. I lost everything. Emily met his eyes, steady, unflinching. And what did you find? The question lingered in the silence. Daniel had no answer. Not yet, but deep inside he knew something had begun to shift. The Ice King was melting. Winter crept into Willow Creek with a quiet certainty. Frost glazed the bookstore windows in the mornings, and Daniel lit the small wood stove beside Emily to keep the chill away. The rhythm of his days had shifted into something steady, almost peaceful, carrying boxes, delivering books, sharing coffee in the diner downstairs. For the first time in years, Daniel felt almost human. That illusion was shattered when a black sedan slid to the curb outside Willow Creek Books. Its tinted window rolled down, and a familiar voice cut through the quiet street. Cross. Daniel froze. The name he had buried months ago hit like a blade. From the car stepped Richard Voss, sleek, polished, predatory. His tailored coat looked absurdly out of place against the small-town backdrop, yet he carried himself as though he owned the ground beneath his feet. Well, well, Richard drawled, his smile sharp, the Ice King hiding in a place no one's heard of. I'd say I'm surprised, but you always did have a flair for the dramatic. Daniel's jaw clenched. What are you doing here? Looking for you, of course, Richard said smoothly. You vanished, and Wall Street hasn't been the same without its coldest king. But don't worry, I've kept the empire warm for you. The words burned. Daniel knew then what his gut had whispered all along. You did this, he said, voice low. You set me up. Richard's smile widened, unapologetic. You were too sure no one could touch you. I just proved you wrong. Later that night, they sat across from each other in the diner, neon buzzing faintly above the window. Richard slid a leather folder across the table, contracts gleaming with promises. Here's the deal, he said. I can clear your name, the right people, the right spin, and the fraud vanishes. We'll pin it on some junior exec. You walk back into New York a hero. Your throne is waiting. The Ice King reborn. Daniel stared at the folder. The numbers glowed like temptation itself. Power, wealth, vindication, everything he had clawed for and lost right there within reach. The part of him that had fought his way up from nothing roared to life, hungry. He could almost taste it. But another part remembered Willow Creek, Emily's laughter echoes between the shelves. The way old Mrs. Whitfield's eyes lit up when he carried her parcels. The first time he'd felt peace in years. Still, the hunger gnawed. The next morning, Daniel told Emily. They stood among the bookshelves, sunlight streaming through frosted glass. He held the folder in his hands, heavy as stone. "Richard wants me back," Daniel said. "He can clear my name, restore everything I lost." Emily's expression didn't change. She waited. "It's what I worked for all my life," Daniel said, his voice tight. "I could have it all again." Finally, she spoke. "And what would it cost you?" Daniel frowned. "Nothing. My freedom, my power." "No." She stepped closer, her gaze locking on his. "What would it really cost you? The man you're becoming here. The man who helps without needing credit, who listens, who laughs, who's learning what worth means beyond numbers. Are you ready to throw him away?" Her words struck like lightning. Daniel's chest tightened. "Emily." His voice cracked. "I don't know who I am without it. The money, the power, it's all I've ever known." She placed a hand on his arm, warm and steady. "You're Daniel, not the Ice King, not the headlines, just Daniel. Isn't that enough?" Richard didn't let up. Calls, meetings, promises. He pressed harder, dangling riches and control, a throne rebuilt brick by brick. One night, outside the diner, Richard cornered him. "Don't be a fool," he hissed. "You belong in New York, not hauling boxes in some forgotten bookstore. You're a king. Stop pretending you're a peasant." Daniel said nothing, but inside, the war raged. He knew that if he walked back into Richard's world, he would lose everything he had begun to build here. Emily, the town, himself. The decision came in the quiet hours before dawn. Daniel sat at the small desk in his rented room, the folder open. The contracts gleamed with empty promises. He picked up a pen, not to sign, but to write. Names, dates, evidence. A confession of Richard's manipulation, the truth behind the fraud. By sunrise, Daniel was on the phone with the authorities. His voice was calm and steady, not cold anymore, but resolute. He gave them everything. The Ice King wasn't coming back. The storm broke quickly. Within days, the headlines that once damned him now screamed a new name: Richard Voss, charged in fraud. Scandal. Daniel Cross exonated. The Ice King cleared. Federal investigators traced the falsified records back to Richard's network of shell companies. Emails that had framed Daniel were exposed as forgeries. Footage of Richard's arrest replayed across every channel, him in a tailored coat, wrists in cuffs, his trademark smile finally gone. Daniel watched the broadcast from the diner, surrounded by townsfolk who had once eyed him with suspicion. Now they offered cautious pats on the back, murmurs of congratulations, but there was no triumph in his chest, no hunger for power, only relief and a strange, steady clarity. That evening, Daniel walked to Willow Creek Books. The bell above the door chimed, and Emily looked up from behind the counter. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Well?" she asked softly. "It's over," Daniel said. "My name is cleared. I could go back, reclaim everything." Her hands stilled on the receipts. "And will you?" Daniel crossed the shop slowly, stopping in front of her. He shook his head. No, her breath caught. "I don't want the empire anymore," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't want to be the Ice King. I want this. I want us." For the first time, the walls around his heart fell completely. Emily's eyes softened, and the choice became real in the silence between them. Daniel had chosen love. He had chosen worth. He had chosen himself. Spring came to Willow Creek. With Daniel's help, the bookstore slowly transformed. He used his knowledge honestly, this time not to build empires, but to build a community hub. He organized readings, brought in local authors, and hosted story hours for children. Teens found part-time jobs at the register. Neighbors stopped in not just for books, but for connection. Daniel Cross, once the Ice King, was no more. In his place stood Daniel Hale, a man reborn, no longer defined by ice, but by warmth. His new kingdom wasn't built on billions, but on love, humility, and truth. And every time he looked at Emily Carter, standing beside him in that little shop on Main Street, he knew beyond doubt he had chosen the right kingdom.